Hello, and welcome to episode 515 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, and with me, as always, is my co-host, esteemed author and historian in his sartorial splendor. People liked that one last time, so I'm going to do it again. My good friend John Parshall. How are you, John?
I'm well. I think I'm just as tired as you are because you and I were both up way too late last night
Yes.
watching the Nautilus dive on the USS Laffey, and
Hmm.
neither of us could tear ourselves away from the monitors until it was far too late. But yeah, nevertheless, here
Yes.
we are, a little crispy around the gills, but ready to go.
And crispy around the gills. Yeah, it was hard to peel myself out of the rack this morning at
Yep.
0530, but such as it is, here we are.
Yes.
But it was worth it. That's pretty damn
Yes.
cool.
Mm.
And it continues too.
It
So anyway.
continues. Yeah, they're on Udachi even as we speak, and I'm like, no, must focus. Okay.
Yeah, no, I had to pull myself away as well.
Yeah.
All right. So here we go. This is a very important topic this week, and I'm sure this one's going to appeal to a lot of people because I think they know the plans for Pearl Harbor, but they don't
Yeah.
know the plans for Pearl Harbor. So we're going to get into that right now. So the road to Pearl Harbor was not a straight one. For years, the United States and Japan had danced together along the road to war. War nearly came in 1937 when the Japanese supposedly, accidentally, sank the gunboat USS Panay in the Yangtze River. Hawks and the United States government screamed for war then, and while cooler heads did prevail, things were never quite the same after that year. As the Japanese continued to push through China, the U.S. sanctions against Japanese grew ever more confining. Initial sanctions on scrap iron, avgas, and the like were a slap on the wrist of Japan, and everyone knew it. The war in China continued to rage, and Japan continued to look for ways to end it, moving into French Indochina in 1940 and moving further south into that same country again in 1941 was the straw that broke the camel's back for the U.S. and Roosevelt in 1941. Though diplomacy was still attempted through the summer of 41, after the U.S. oil embargo was placed on Japan, the empire had one road to take, and that was to all out war with the United States.
Mhm.
Early in 1941, aware that talks were probably not going to go their way, the Japanese military, specifically the Imperial Japanese Navy, began to plan for war with the U.S. The man whose job it would be to attack the U.S. wanted no part of it, but felt that if his country was to go to war, the attack that would start the war had to be hard, surprising, and lethal. As such, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku and a team of brilliant planners laid out their ideas for swiping swiftly at the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Tremendous training, innovation, deceit, and luck were all a part of the Japanese plan. John, this
Yeah.
is going to be cool, man. Let's
Yeah.
wrap on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all starts at the top, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Yamamoto's the guy that you got to kind of talk about in this respect, and he was a very interesting fellow. I mean, this is a gentleman who had lived in the U.S., had been a naval attaché, and had traveled extensively throughout the United States, and so he had a good sense for just how powerful we were as a potential opponent. And as you mentioned, not in favor of any sort of a war against the US, but eventually gets dragged into it in any case. So he had studied during the 1920s. He was actually at the U.S. Naval War College. And it was then that he decided to make a bit of a career switch and moved into the aviation realm. He did not become a pilot himself in the vein of folks like Ernie King or Halsey, but he was still a huge advocate for air power. And as such, kind of found himself in a little bit of a radical sect. There's another gentleman that is sort of a fellow traveler of his, a guy named Inoue Shigeyoshi. Inoue is going to end up being the admiral in charge of the Coral Sea operation. Inoue, too, was very much an aviation proponent. And at one point, Inoue publishes a tract that basically calls for the scrapping of all of their battleships and the devotion of the Navy's entire budget to building aircraft carriers and
Yeah.
land-based air groups. And of course, that was met with,
Like a fart in church.
yeah, exactly, guns blazing from, the
Right.
battleship club. Yeah, that was not well, didn't go over well. The other thing that's going on here that you have to keep in mind is that when the naval treaties were signed between, first the Washington Naval Treaty and then the London Naval Treaty that laid down all of these various restrictions on the building programs of all of the major navies, there was a lot of controversy about that within Japan because the Japanese, with some justification, felt that they had gotten the short end of the stick in those negotiations. And so what ends up happening is the Imperial Navy sort of splits into two between the treaty faction, which was in favor of the treaty, and the so-called fleet faction, which hated it, with every fiber of their being. And eventually, what ends up happening is the fleet faction comes out on top. And there's in particular a guy named Kato Kanji, who is the head of one of the most influential guys in the fleet faction. And even though he ends up getting sort of sidelined in the course of these factional politics, nevertheless, his thinking pervades a lot of the other people within the Navy. So the net result is that when the fleet faction comes out on top in about the mid 1930s, a lot of the treaty faction guys get either forcibly retired or sidelined. And so Yamamoto, along with Inoue, and a couple other dudes. I think, Ozawa probably would have been within the treaty faction as well. But there's now just a very small group of survivors from the treaty faction, and Yamamoto is one of them, which speaks to his abilities, I think, as, first of all, a bureaucratic infighter in his own right, and also the fact that he's recognized within the Navy, at least, as being a pretty brilliant guy in a lot of ways and a good organizer and so forth. So, anyway, he comes through all of that stuff.
You you said you mentioned the word survivor,
Yeah,
and I know you just said that, but it makes sense to talk about what I have next in the notes is that because of Yamamoto's feelings towards naval aviation, on top of the fact that he was a very outspoken advocate for peace with the United States. He did not want to go to war with the U.S. for the reasons that you mentioned before. He was
yeah,
aware of our industrial power. He knew that, the Japanese military faction at the time had a serious misjudgment of American character. I
right.
think that's almost indisputable. But Yamamoto knew. That being said, he opposed the war in China from the get-go. He
Yep.
opposed the expansion of the war in China. He also opposed the signing of the Tripartite Pact and he wasn't afraid to say as much. Like
Yes.
he had no problem saying this sucks and this is stupid, this is a bad idea, and it made him a lot of enemies as well.
Yes.
And you said survivor because he was the target of several of as oh good Lord, assassination plots, was he not?
Yeah, there were certainly inklings that
Yeah.
there were junior officers that wanted to do away with him, and yeah, this is the kind of outspoken behavior that would collect you an assassin's bullet, and had done in a number of other politicians within the government who had not towed the line in terms of espousing the correct rhetoric and being sufficiently aggressive in terms of doling out the money for the military budgets. And so yeah, the fact that he was rumored to be the target of assassination attempts, that's one of the things that eventually seems to sort of kick him up to the role of commander in chief of the combined fleet, because that way they can keep him at sea or
Mhm.
safer. He's safer on a warship than he is in Tokyo, is kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah. And we talked several weeks, and of course, this is all part of our Pearl Harbor series. And we talked several weeks ago about Tora Tora Tora. And on a whim, I hadn't seen it in a couple of years, so I popped it in this
Yeah,
past weekend and watched it. And of course, that's one of the opening scenes. Is I believe it's Fuchida or Genda. I think it's Fuchida who says that. Oh, Yamamoto. Of course, this is set back in 1940. Now Yamamoto is coming. He's a CNC and he's coming aboard the ship so we can keep him safe. But that was a real thing, though.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I haven't dug into that in any great depth. Understand that the amount of Western source material that we really have about this guy is fairly limited. I mean, there's one good biography of the dude. A gentleman named Agawa wrote a biography called The Reluctant Admiral, and that's where a
Mhm.
lot of our information about him, other than anecdotal stuff that comes from other sources, that's the one biography of him. Um, The other thing I would say is that he's commonly held up after the war as being a brilliant strategist and operational planner, and I would take issue with that. I think that if you look at his obviously his planning of certain operations like Midway, that was not all that great. On the other hand, I think that Yamamoto is he's the product of an institutional system and a training system, and it wasn't just that Yamamoto was kind of a weird planner in terms of dispersing formations and that sort of thing. This was endemic to the Japanese Navy as a whole. That you see subsequent plans even after Yamamoto is dead, you know, plans like the battle for Leyte Gulf and so forth are similarly complex. The Japanese just loved this kind of stuff when it came to naval operations. And so, um, nevertheless, I mean, the the sort of the scope of the Pearl Harbor plan and the nugget of the Pearl Harbor plan is, I think, pretty brilliant in a lot of ways, and it ends up getting carried off at least reasonably well. It's not perfect, but yeah, the basic plan itself ends up being pretty damn sound.
Yeah. So he, like we said just a minute ago, he was aware that the United States and Japan were eventually going to clash. And I think anybody, including people in the United States, especially in the US Navy and the Pacific, were obviously very aware that things were probably going to come to a head in the near
Yep.
future. So to that end, I put this, he met with Konoe in 1940. And of course, there's a lot of quotes that are attributed to Yamamoto, and probably half of them are false, not the least of which is the sleeping giant. We won't even get into
Yeah.
that. But one thing that he did apparently say, and Konoe confirmed this, is that, he asked if we go to war with the United States, what can you tell me? And
Yeah.
Yamamoto says, I can run wild for 6 months to a year, and after that, I guarantee you nothing. So he knew right
Yep.
off the bat that if we have to go to war with these people, which I do not want to do, we're going
Yep.
to have to start it on our end, our
Yep.
way, and it's going to be my way. And that, of course, leads to the snowball effect
Right.
that we
Right.
see.
And and yeah, that particular quote you can find several different
Different
instantiations.
versions, yeah, right.
Yeah, and said to different people. So it to my mind that makes it more credible in that we have different witnesses who seem to corroborate that he said that or the variation of that, the run wild thing for the first 6 months to a year. But what that does then is it sets the clock explicitly running. You know, Yamamoto knows that he's got to get this war over with within about a
Fast.
year.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be fast, which means that it's got to be maximally front loaded, as you say. It's got to achieve massive impact on not only American fighting ability, but also American fighting spirit. And so
Right.
that's the thing that you see built into this operation from the get-go is not only is it intended to cripple our battle fleet, it's also intended to crush our morale at the outset because throughout 42 and early 43, he's always looking for an opening to try to destroy American morale because he knows at the end of the day, it's only a lack of political will that will deprive the US of the ability to eventually crush Japan.
He has a quote, and again, whether this is him or not, and I'm fairly certain it is, because like you said, I found this one in several books, and it goes like this. He says in January 1941, quote, should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough. So this goes into the whole punch you in the face
Yep,
attack. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians, among whom armchair arguments about war are being glibly bandied about in the name of state politics, have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices, unquote.
right.
And that's really rather profound. And of course, there's edited versions of that says that he's going to make
Yes,
peace in the White House, which is baloney because
we
the
we
U.S.
twist.
press, yeah,
Yeah, we end up twisting his
yeah,
words, you know, for propaganda purposes on
hmm
for domestic consumption on our end, you
and it
know,
works. But
and it works. to portray him as this sort of arrogant guy who wants to march into DC. But really, what he's telling his fellow compatriots is these guys are going to fight and they're not going to give up easy. And if you think that you're going to beat them, you are going to have the ability to bring the war to their shores and beyond, which is a subtle way of telling them, and we have no capability of doing that. What are you
Right.
smoking?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack when you look at, and there were some Japanese subs, of course, that were operating off the West Coast that did
Mhm.
things like shelled a refinery and stuff like that.
Right.
And the West Coast just panics. Everybody just loses their cookies. And at that
I know
point,
what
of
you were going to
course,
say, but that's fine.
yeah, um, the Japanese look 10 foot tall at this
Yeah.
point in the war, and there's this notion that my God, they could invade us. And from the Japanese perspective, that was never in the cards. They knew that they couldn't do that. Yes, they eventually had some ambitions of taking Hawaii. That was
Sure.
very real. And the logistics may have been there barely to do that, but there was no way that the Japanese were coming to the West Coast, and they knew that from the outset. Certainly, Yamamoto knew that.
Yeah. So as the war grew closer and closer and became, in Yamamoto's eyes, inevitable, as I put in the notes, he begins to prepare.
Yeah,
And he begins to prepare for this all-out punch in the face, which of course is going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor. He, like everybody else, because he had studied in the United States, he had been to the Naval War College, he'd studied at the Naval War College. He was aware of the US's age-old battle plan to fight a war with Japan, War Plan Orange, Rainbow, all that jazz. Go march across the Pacific, start in the Marshalls, and just keep on trucking, and we beat you in a
yep,
big fleet battle off the coast of Japan. Boom. He was aware of that. He was also aware that any thrust towards the Dutch East Indies, because Roosevelt had said as much, was going to bring a war probably with the United States, Great Britain. So he
right.
figures that he's got to knock out the biggest threat in the Pacific because, again, and this is super important, you've said this a million times, but it's worth repeating, is that Pearl Harbor was just a part
Yes.
of their, what
Um,
I call an oceanic blitzkrieg.
yeah, a much larger plan of campaign. And so really Pearl Harbor is tactically offensive, but operationally and strategically defensive in that it is to cripple the American battle fleet so that that fleet is not in a position to come across the
Right.
Central Pacific aimed either to the west or the southwest and go into the flank and rear of this advance, which is going south towards Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's the deal.
All right. So he was aware, and I put this quote in here from David Evans, and I got a couple in there from him because they were brilliant. He says, David Evans says, quote, a quantitatively inferior naval power, Japan's best hope lay in a qualitatively superior strategy, a
Yeah.
violent and crippling first blow at America's main battle force in the first few hours of the war.
Yep.
Yamamoto knew that, and he, as we're going to see through some of these arguments that we'll talk about later, he appears to be one of the very few people in the Imperial Japanese Navy that did know that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what's going on, not only in the Imperial Navy, but the Army as well, is that there is a sort of sense of provincialism. Not all of these guys have studied overseas or abroad. Not
Sure,
all of them have had the benefit of being a naval attaché, either in the US or, in London or something like that. And so just like any other military, if you're stuck in your bubble and don't have an opportunity to get an outside perspective, it's tough to really internalize. What does the industrial heartland of the U.S. actually look like? There's
right.
this swath of factories which stretches from New York across the Midwest and the Great Lakes all the way to the Iron Range in Minnesota, where our iron all comes from, the biggest reserves in the world. There's this enormous industrial heartland there that a lot of Japanese officers will not have seen and will not have been in a position to emotionally process, if you will,
Sure.
the true impact of that. But nevertheless, Yamamoto gets it. And so, as you say, this thing has got to be absolutely front loaded and maximally violent.
All right, so the seed of the attack of Pearl Harbor is planted in Yamamoto's mind, and as Fukuda says, he rates it March, April 1940 is when Yamamoto first like brings the plan
Yeah.
out, if you will, births the plan for lack of a better term. And this is when he starts laying out the first ideas for the Pearl Harbor attack.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because the actual timing for this sort of inspiration, I think, is somewhat nebulous, and we are really relying on other sources like Fukuda and some of the other surviving planners from his staff. So I think there were a lot of ideas being kicked around at this point in time. But the thing that's interesting to me is early 1940, the imperial military as a whole was not thinking about war against the Western powers. The army in particular was very much oriented towards war with the Soviets, as we know. And there's this persistent myth, again, post-war, that the reason we got our butts kicked so bad by the Japanese at the beginning of the war is they'd been planning this for decades, and that's baloney. In fact, that there were only a couple of cases in 1940, even within the army, that some of the division staffs were, sort of mulling on ideas. What would happen if we ended up in a place like Malaya? You're crazy, man. We're going to be in China forever. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that if Yamamoto did in fact have this sort of eureka moment in the beginning of 1940, he's ahead of the curve. He is starting planning actions on an offensive against the enemy that, and they are radically different, obviously, than any of the existing plans for a blue water clash of fleets in the middle of the ocean somewhere around the Marshalls. Yeah, so he's definitely ahead of the curve, at least in terms of anticipating that a war with the U.S. may entail this sort of southern advance, and that therefore I've got to hit the Americans at the outset at Pearl.
Hmm.
That's kind of a leap.
Well, he did, according to what I was able to find, Onishi Takajiro, of course, is the father of the kamikaze,
Yeah,
also
and
later on
another
in the war.
big air power advocate as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yamamoto orders him to do a feasibility study. So I guess maybe I should
Mhm.
retract what I said, where he starts the plan. He doesn't. He, is this even going to work? Could it
Right.
work?
Could
Are
it
we going to
work?
get our plows cleaned if we go out there? Is it even a viable option? Should I have to do this?
Right.
And Onishi comes back and he says, "Yeah, it might work." I mean, they don't get into all the details, but he says, "Yeah, it could work. If we use
Right.
aircraft carriers and we do this and we do that." And that's where the seed starts to germinate, I guess, more than
Yeah.
anything else. He's got that in the back of his mind that it says, if I have to go to war with the United States, and if I'm ordered to commence hostilities with this
Yeah.
massively powerful nation, I'm going to hit them where they are most vulnerable, which is going to be Pearl Harbor, because by now the fleet is there.
Yes.
U.S.
That's right.
Pacific Fleet is in Pearl Harbor and has been there for quite some time and clearly isn't going anywhere. If I'm going to have to hit them, I'm going to hit them there, and I'm going to hit them hard with a sledgehammer to the face.
Right. And this also has precedent within the Imperial Navy as a whole. They started off their war with the Russians back in 1904 with a surprise torpedo boat attack on those battleships that were in Port Arthur at the time. And so, there are echoes of earlier Japanese operations that carry forward into the formulation of this new brainchild of his. But the notion of doing it with aircraft, of course, is just completely new.
Right. And again, I'm going to say this every time, but a quote that is attributed to Yamamoto that we don't know for sure, but
Right.
it seems that it most certainly did probably say something akin to this. Quote, "We should do our very best at the outset of the war with the United States to decide the fate of the war on the very first day. And in case the majority of the enemy's main force is at Pearl Harbor, attack it vigorously with our Air Force and blockade the harbor," unquote.
Yeah.
Supposedly, this quote came out in January of 1941, which
Right.
is when, because you put in the notes, don't know exactly when I went and checked before we recorded. It was January 1941 is when they attribute the quote to Yamamoto. So
Yeah.
he
And by
goes in
this
and
point, yeah, our fleet has been in Pearl Harbor for quite a while at this point.
for 6 months, 7 months, something like that.
7 months, because I thought that it was April that we did the fleet exercises
I
that
have to go back and look.
Now our viewers are going to just tear us apart. You don't know this off the
Yeah.
top of your head?
Oh, sorry, don't. Know a
Anyway,
lot of
okay.
stuff, but not that particular seed of
Yes.
information, even though we
Yeah.
just talked about it 2 weeks ago.
Right.
But seriously.
You get to
So
this age, like, and it's a zero-sum game, baby. Brain cells have to be pushed out for new information
correct.
to be pushed in. So, yeah, anyway.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's like putting sausage in the skin. Something's got to get,
Yep.
it's got to go somewhere, man.
Right.
So, so anyway, Yamamoto talks to Oikawa, who is the naval minister,
Yep.
and he starts to lay out the plan for what will eventually be the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it obviously it changes here and there, and different things happen, and we'll get to that
A
in a
lot
minute.
of things happen. Yeah.
But he says he wants to use the first and second carrier divisions would be utilized to, quote, launch a forced or surprise attack with all their air strength, risking themselves on a moonlit night or dawn, unquote. That's what he says. Among other things, Yamamoto outlined that submarines would, quote, attack the enemy fleeing in confusion after closing in on Pearl Harbor, and if possible, to attack them at the entrance of Pearl Harbor so that the entrance may be blocked with sunken ships. And he also I'll put there and several tankers for refueling at sea.
Right.
So as I put in the notes, this is essentially the skeleton of the
Yeah.
plan for Pearl. And this is in January of 1941 when he spits this out right here.
Right. Right. Yeah,
So go
that's
ahead.
that
Go
that
ahead.
that is the heart of the beast right there. That
Yeah.
that essentially is what Pearl Harbor becomes. At this point, of course, Shokaku and Zuikaku are building. They
Mhm.
only have two big fleet divisions to play with us at this point: Akagi and Kaga, Cardiff 1, Soryu and Hiryu, Cardiff 2. Cardiff 5 will be available to them starting in about October of 1941,
Mhm.
but events start moving very, very quickly at this point.
So I put it in the notes, and or you put it here, and then I put it later, but we'll talk about it now. There's
Yeah,
another myth that is out there, and that the
right.
Japanese were informed by the raid on Toronto that they were like Toronto, not Toronto, not Canada.
Rancid. No,
Toronto, sorry. They didn't raid Canada. Sorry, Mike. But but anyhow, the raid on
right.
Toronto that
Yes.
influenced Yamamoto and Genda and Fuchida and all this other jazz, and that isn't so.
Which, to my way of thinking, is just yet another example of, yeah, Westerners claiming, authorship of stuff that obviously no Eastern mind could have thought up, and this it's all
Right.
baloney. So,
Right.
backstory. Um, yes, the British had executed a brilliant raid in November of 1940 against the Italian fleet base at Taranto, and they had attacked it with a couple dozen of their of those incredibly ancient,
Very
uh,
swordfish, yeah.
yeah, fairy swordfish, which is a great plane. Don't get me wrong, but it is a biplane. Let's be real here. Nevertheless, the attack results were absolutely brilliant. They crippled three of Italy's six battleships and knocked at least one of them out of the war basically permanently. It was under repair forever. Um, but the material point here is that Yamamoto had already started thinking along the lines of attacking Pearl Harbor well prior to the raid against Taranto. That is not to say that the Japanese weren't very interested in those results. They did send a naval attaché to Taranto to, sort of view what had gone on there. And among other things, it confirmed the notion that if you modified your torpedoes correctly, you could use them in fairly shallow waters, because the Brits did exactly that. So they certainly took that kernel back to the operational planners, in terms of factoring that into the Pearl Harbor attack. But if you just look at the sheer scale of the two operations,
Yeah, it's
I would
completely
argue
different.
that, yeah, I mean, Taranto is sort of the Model T version of
Right.
what Pearl Harbor is going to be, because
Yeah.
eventually what ends up happening in terms of the scope of the Pearl Harbor plan is not just to attack the naval anchorage, but to come in and shut down every single
Mhm.
airfield on the island of Oahu simultaneously, so that the organic air power that is on Oahu doesn't have the ability to reach out and touch the Japanese carrier fleet. The British knew they couldn't do that at Toronto. They knew that they had to do a night attack, sneak in, do their thing, and then get the hell out of Dodge because their carrier did not have the ability to survive come the following day in the threat environment that the Italians and the Germans could create in the central Mediterranean. Pearl Harbor is a completely different beast. What ends up eventually happening is that it's Kido Butai that is going to be the threat environment. We're going to bring this massive aerial force to Oahu, and we're just going to stomp on it.
And
So
that's incredibly important too. We refer to all the attacks on Oahu as Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, again, much like the attack on Pearl Harbor was part of the larger Oceanic Blitzkrieg, the attack on Pearl Harbor was part of the larger attack on Oahu itself. So it's actually
correct.
the air raid on Oahu. It's not the air raid on
Yeah,
Pearl Harbor, although that was part of it.
right. No, I think that's correct. I mean, again, I've said this on a number of occasions. If you do a breakdown of the individual sorties that are being sent by both the first and the second attack wave, half or more are being used for air supremacy and air suppression attacks, as opposed to attacks against the anchorage itself. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. So an attack let's just focus on the anchorage here. Let's talk
yeah,
about Pearl Harbor itself, the fleet. Yamamoto knew that an attack on Pearl Harbor was risky for multiple reasons,
absolutely.
not the least of which is if the fleet gets discovered, if Kido Butai or what becomes Kido Butai gets discovered, and they could be ambushed themselves out in the middle of the water, and
Yeah,
boom, they lose the fleet, and now Japan's really up the creek. Or, there's a lot of things that could go wrong here.
yeah,
And any
absolutely.
failure that happens on the attack on Oahu, specifically Pearl Harbor, would put the ultimate goal, which is, of course, moving into the Dutch East Indies and grabbing those
Right.
resource fields in major, major jeopardy. So he knew this
Yeah,
plan was risky from the get-go, and that leads to a lot of opposition. We can get to that in a second. But
yeah,
what's your take on this?
yeah. That you're absolutely right. If you read some of the translated versions of Senshi Sosho, the Japanese war history series, they emphasize in a couple of their early war volumes that they understood that the success of the war plan as a whole depended on how the attack on Pearl Harbor went. And
Mhm.
that, yeah, there were a lot of things that could go wrong with this thing. You're sticking your neck out really, really far. I forget the exact distance, but I feel like it's around 3,500 nautical miles from Tokyo to Pearl Harbor. You're going to send this naval force across, hopefully, the trackless wastes of the North Pacific, and it's hopefully not going to get detected. But then at the tip of the spear, then your Air Force has actually got to deliver and knock out an extremely diverse set of targets on this enemy bastion. We got to suppress the airfields. We got to shoot down any enemy fighters. And Battleship Row in particular offers a very thorny target set to go after, in that you've got
Yeah.
battleships that are moored inboard and outboard. How do I attack both of those targets, particularly the inboard ones? And the answer to that did not become apparent until later in the planning process.
So to that end, you said sticking your neck out. And
Yeah,
by that, of course, you're talking about the carrier strength. And there was
yeah,
significant opposition within the
yes,
Japanese military. And this again comes from David Evans because it's brilliant. It goes, quote, wisdom and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but wisdom and propriety of the Hawaii operation, the Chief of Staff's operations section, Captain Tomioka Satatoshi, provided an extensive list of objections to the Hawaii plan. I would bet he did. I bet it was as long as my arm, man.
yeah.
In
Well, and
some,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, I was
No,
going to
no, do
say,
your thing.
in some, he argued that the Japanese Navy, and this is important, could not afford to wager its carefully built up naval air strength in such a desperately risky venture, particularly in view of the fact that it would be needed in other major operations. It makes perfect sense. It really does. More than anything else, Tomioka feared that that diverting surface and air strength to the Hawaii attack would critically undermine the southern operation and hence the major operation objectives of the coming war. And I won't read the
Yes,
rest because it's
that's
subversive.
that's exactly right. And so Captain Tomioka is a recurring character in the early part of this war, and that he's also going to be the dude who is going to raise the laundry list of objections to the Midway operation when Yamamoto raises that operational plan, 6 months into the war, 4 months into the war. And I find it ironic here because, of course, Yamamoto is going to end up being vindicated. Tomioka is
Sure.
kind of he's the wet towel, right? He's the guy that is just this Debbie Downer.
Right.
Debbie Downer Tomioka is like rain pissing on my planning again. So Tomioka is going to be wrong in this instance, but he's going to be so right when it comes to Midway.
Yeah, he
And
is.
I would be fascinated to know how he felt about all of that. You're absolutely right that a lot of the Japanese military, like, if we're going to bet the ranch on this whole southern approach, we got to put all of our eggs into one basket down there, because the principle of mass is a fairly well understood guiding principle for military operational planning. And so, this notion that you're going to take all your big flight decks and you're going to use them for this wild goose chase out in Hawaii when we've got things to do down in the southern operation area, just how do you propose that we get around that? What ends up happening later in the planning process for the southern advance is that they look through the tool cabinet and find other tools to do things. So, for instance, if you look at the destruction of Force Z, the Repulse, and the Prince of Wales, the fact that there were going to be fast battleships accompanying the Hawaiian task force meant that there was not going to be sufficient big gun power down in the southern area to contest the seas against those two British warships. And so what they end up doing then is pumping the theater full of ground-based aviation units to go after those ships, and that's a deliberate quote that Yamamoto makes at that point. We cannot afford to fight the enemy king with our king. We've got to figure out a way to capture the king with a pawn. And so they're gonna use alternative means, i.e., air power, to go after those things. So that there's a lot of juking and jiving that's going on here in terms of the overall operational plan. It's like a balloon. You squeeze in one side and something else pops out. They don't really have enough naval assets to do all this stuff if Yamamoto is going to be given his head to go ahead and actually do this operation against Pearl Harbor.
So to that end, he is push Yamamoto is pushing. He wants four carriers. He wants
Yeah.
Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu to
Yep.
take part in this operation. And almost immediately that is rebuffed.
Yeah.
The general staff, naval general staff is like, nah, nah. If you're going to do this, you can have two, but you can't have all four, because exactly to your point, we're going to, and again, whatchamacallit, Shokaku and Zuikaku hadn't been commissioned yet.
Correct.
Um, we need these other two flight decks down here for the main course down here, if you will. So
Right.
they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and this goes all through the summer of 1941 into the fall,
Into the
and
fall.
it starts to get kind of not
We're
kind of
but
but testy,
Yeah. Well, and we're bumping up against
time.
planning. Yeah,
Yeah.
deadlines at this point. The military has made this decision that they want to initiate hostilities originally in October of 41. It eventually gets pushed out to December. But yeah, if you can't make up your minds as to where those carriers are going to be, obviously is sort of hamstringing Yamamoto in terms of his planning for this operation against Pearl Harbor, because he doesn't know if he's going to have the assets necessary to pull it off.
So the wargaming that had gone back and forth, because the Japanese wargame everything, if they're moving a fleet tug, they wargame the fleet tug. And they wargamed this multiple times, and it had been proven that three carriers would work, four carriers were better.
Yeah,
But as I put in a note, that's not the iron fist that Yamamoto wants to bring to the party. And
yeah,
now Shokaku and Zuikaku are part of the fleet.
yeah.
They're brand spanking new. And he immediately says, I want all six of these guys. And they immediately say, the general staff says, are you high? And then he says, you know what? If you don't take my plan and you don't do what I want to do, then I'm going to resign. That
Along with
is,
my entire staff.
well, and I was going to ask you to get into that. I mean, this is
Yeah,
ballsy, for lack of a better term, on Yamamoto's part. Where either we play
Another
my
term,
game or we're not playing at all.
yeah, ballsy is one term. Blackmail is another term.
Right.
Frankly, I mean, when you think about it, he is he is stealing the planning prerogative from his boss, Admiral Nagano, and
Mhm.
the staff that is in Tokyo, cats like Tomioka. I mean, those are the dudes that are supposed to be planning this war. Who the hell is the commander in chief of Combined Fleet? I mean, yes, he's a bigwig, but he works for Admiral Nagano. And on the eve of what is arguably the most important war in the nation's history, Yamamoto is saying, I'm
Yeah.
leaving. I'm taking my whole staff too. And it works. And think
Yeah.
about that. I
Yeah.
mean, um, I'm trying to think of a similar example. And the one that comes to mind is in July of 1942, when the British tell General Marshall that we really don't think, I say, oh boy, this notion of yours of doing a cross channel invasion anytime too soon. I'm so sorry, but we're just not interested in doing that. When he gets that message on July 7th or 8th, he then goes to King and Marshall go to FDR and they say, well, this sucks. And we're just going to reorient our entire strategy towards a Pacific based strategy and screw the Brits, essentially. And FDR basically says, wrong. You
Right.
FDR. And this is one of the few times that he signed a memo, Commander in Chief. Like, you
Mhm.
work for me, bitches, and you're
Right.
not going to be doing this. Okay. So, again, to take it
True.
back to Yamamoto, for him to arrogate, the planning prerogatives of Naval GHQ and say it's my way or the highway, there's a credible argument to be made that they should have just drummed him out of the service at that point.
Mhm.
That that okay, fine, you go along, and we'll plan the war the way that we want to plan it. But what this points to is two different things. First of all, the Japanese, there's this, as we've discussed, there's this weird streak of insubordination that runs
Right.
through these military organizations, and yet at the same time, they are often very consensus oriented. It's weird. And Nagano was an older gentleman at this point. He was 62. God, he was my age, and did not have the kind of drive and personality to lasso Yamamoto and say, "No, dog, you're going to do it my way. I'm the boss here." But
Right.
that's not the kind of guy that he was, and so what ends up happening is, yes, Yamamoto plays what is, in my opinion, a fairly slimy card, the blackmail card, and it works. And now that he's played it once, guess what? If
Yeah, he's
his
gonna do it again.
operation goes well, who gains enormous political power as a result of that having worked?
Mhm.
So there you have
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So obviously they relent, and
Yes.
we talked about, one of the major reasons why A is, and I think something else to be said too is Yamamoto was a popular guy.
Yeah.
He was a well-known dude, and of course his fame only grows as the war progresses,
Well, and
but
that's the thing. I mean, it's really going to grow after the
sure.
beginning of this war here.
But he
Um,
had a lot of sway. I mean, he had a lot of,
yeah,
stroke.
I'm Yes, and combined fleet in wartime is, hands down the most important military organization within the imperial military. You could argue it's even more important than the Kwantung Army. It is certainly represents much more national treasure than the Kwantung Army, and
Oh
that
yeah,
warships
more
are
money.
incredibly expensive to build. So, in a certain sense, he is the most important soldier within Imperial Japan at this point in time. And you're absolutely right. He does have a lot of cachet, but this is still a military organization. And in the end of the day, people are expected to salute and say, yes, sir. And if Naval GHQ says, no, you can't have all those carriers, then he would have had to have figured out a way to do without.
Yeah,
But that's not what happens. Yeah.
that is not what happens.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read these verbatim because this comes straight out of the Japanese plan.
Yeah.
So as things continue to progress, the Japanese military lays out basically objectives for the campaign. And again, remember, it's not just attacking the
Right.
battle wagons anchored off of Ford Island. It's a whole lot of stuff. So, quote, the general aims of the entire campaign were predicated on the desires for military conquest and security and enhancement of the empire by the occupation of areas rich in natural resources. Number one, in the east, the American fleet will be destroyed and American lines of operation and supply lines to the Orient will be cut. Number two, in the west, British Malaya will be occupied and British lines of operation and supply lines to the Orient, as well as the Burma Road, will be cut. Number three, enemy forces in the Orient will be destroyed and bases of operations will be seized and areas with natural resources will be occupied. Number four, strategic areas will be seized and developed. Defenses will be strengthened in order to establish a durable basis for operations. Number five, enemy forces will be intercepted and annihilated. Number six, victories will be exploited to break the enemy's will to fight.
Yes.
And that's it's in
That's
a
the war.
nutshell. And that's really their whole war plan in a
That's the
nutshell
whole.
right there.
Yeah. Well, and you'll notice some things. Okay, so let's look at a couple of these.
Dissect it. Yes.
Yeah, and, number one, in the east, the American fleet will be destroyed and American lines of operation and supply lines to the Orient will be cut. The underlying subtext there is we're isolating the Philippines. We cannot allow the Americans to reinforce the Philippines. You could go even further and suggest that the Japanese are already looking ahead to the cutting of supply lines to Australia, if you consider Australia part of the Orient, which I kind of don't.
No.
But to me, the main thrust here is that they know that they're going to have to isolate the Philippines and truncate the ability of the Americans to counterattack it. In the west, British Malaya will be occupied and British lines of operation and supply lines to the Orient, as well as the Burma Road, will be cut.
That's
That
the
is
key.
that's the key. That's the
Yep.
Imperial Army talking right there. Because one of the reasons that the Imperial Army accedes to the notion that we must advance south is not only because of oil, but because they think that they can end the war in China by cutting the Burma Road and isolating the nationalist government and forcing them to the table.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's absolutely obligatory. And you'll notice that it is item number two on the list, which gives you an indication of just how incredibly important the Japanese viewed the Malayan
Right.
campaign as being. You got to take Singapore because it is the plug in all of the sea lanes down there that would prevent British reinforcements from either reinforcing the Dutch or the Australians or helping us out or what have you. They've got to get rid of Singapore.
Yeah. And the key that the Burma Road, the text Burma Road in there is like a red flag just going,
Yeah.
look at me,
Yeah.
look at me, look at me, because you cut that Burma Road, you cut that supply line, which is what it was,
Yep.
to China, and that just further weakens Chiang's position, and hopefully we can get this friggin' morass over with here in the near future.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is how the Japanese delude themselves into thinking that launching a war against three new opponents is going to somehow end up better than just fighting the one war that they can't already,
Yeah.
they can't win anyway. Anyway, so yeah,
But
there you have it.
another one other thing I want to point out here, aside from the time that they mentioned natural resources
Sure.
twice, uh, is number four. And I think this is incredibly important because this is where the Marines and the Army are going to do battle in 1943 through 45.
Yep.
Strategic areas will be seized and developed. Defenses will be strengthened in order to establish a durable basis for operations. To me,
Yeah.
that is the defensive ring that we
Yes.
start to crack in
Hmm.
technically Guadalcanal in 1942, but
Yep.
especially with the Central Pacific Drive in 43, and we're moving through. They're laying it out right here.
Yeah. Yeah. That there's going to be a defensive barrier strategy
Yep.
that we are going to, put together to attrit the Americans when they counterattack against us.
Because
One
they
can
know we're
make
going to eventually, unless we just
that's what they
fold like
thought.
out. Yeah, yeah.
Part of the problem that you'll see in the evolving 1942 campaigns is that they would have probably done better to have shifted over to that defensive barrier strategy probably in May. Never have done Midway to start with or what have you. If you really wanted to make those Central Pacific drives bloody for the Americans, it would have been better to start building bunkers in places like Kwajalein now. But
Mhm.
they because this is an offensively oriented military that is also looking to try to end this war with the US through attacking, they never shift over to that defensive stance until it's really too late.
All right, so let's talk about some really interesting
Yeah.
personalities, two of which are very, very famous, and one of which I think people know, but not to the nth degree. The planners. And
Yeah.
Yamamoto, of course, this is his baby, but he
Yeah.
gives it to these guys, Kuroshima, Kusaka, Genda, and Fuchida.
Yeah.
What is their roles in all this, man?
So Captain Kuroshima Kameto was one of the head planners for Yamamoto, and he's this weird, esoteric, monk-like dude that,
Yeah. They called him
uh,
Gandhi, didn't they?
yeah, the planning
Yeah.
Gandhi, and he's sort of the Navy counterpart to Masanobu Tsuji, I would argue, and that he has a reputation for being a brilliant operational planner. And this guy will just lock himself in his cabin for days at a time, and just sweat it out and come out with these plans. But anyway, Kurishima is going to be the guy who is going to be in charge of the overall tactical plan and then divvying out the staff work amongst the other junior staff members to come up with solutions to various operational problems that begin raising themselves, such as how the heck do we attack the inboard battleships and things like that. So that's Kurishima's role. You got Kusaka, who is the chief of staff for what is now First Air Fleet. And there's a whole different tale there, and we'll talk about that in just a second as well. He's Nagumo's right hand man. And it is the traditional role of chiefs of staff to be the head planners for the guy that they are serving underneath. And so, seeing as how First Air Fleet is going to be the primary implement that is going to deliver this attack against the Americans, it makes sense that there has to be a representative from First Air Fleet to be a part of this planning process. And Kusaka is one of those guys. He's sort of the head of those guys. You've got Genda Minoru, who is the air officer within First Air Fleet, and he works for Kusaka. And Genda's brilliant. Genda is recognized as sort of the house genius within First Air Fleet. This guy was handpicked to be the air officer within First Air Fleet because he's just got that kind of a reputation. He was a pilot, a fighter pilot. He had an aerobatic team during the
Yeah.
1930s that went all over the country and basically
Blue
kind of
Angels of their day. Yeah.
Blue Angels. That's exactly what he was. Let's get the kids excited and people excited about naval aviation. Maybe we can get some of them to enlist, blah, 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 showing the naval aviation flag. So
Mhm.
they bring Genda in to be the head air planner then. And it's Genda who's going to be absolutely central to the development of First Air Fleet doctrine, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Final guy in the mix is our buddy Fuchida,
Mhm.
Mitsuo Fuchida, who is going to be the air group commander on Akagi, which is the flagship of Kido Butai. So he's like aviator number one. And Genda handpicks Fuchida to come in and be his attack leader for the Pearl Harbor plan because he knows that Fuchida is a very bright, charismatic individual. He's a natural leader. The aviators love him. And so we want this guy to be in the cockpit of the actual aircraft that are going to be delivering this attack so that he can ride herd over that attack. One of the things I was going to mention, there's a pile of books that one can read on this particular topic. And of course, from
Mhm.
the American side, At Dawn We Slept remains sort of the canonical American source. There are Wenger's books for sort of the tactical aspects. And then I would say I am still
Mm.
very fond of H.P. Wilmot's Pearl Harbor. Look, there we go. And the reason I'm fond of it, even though his name is not on the front cover, is that Wilmot's contributor, not quite co-author, is Haruo Tomatsu, who's one of the foremost naval historians in Japan and teaches at their defense college. And so there's a lot of good stuff in here about the Japanese planning process. Um, Alan Zim's
Yeah.
Attack on Pearl Harbor also has a lot of good stuff. The other thing I would plug too is that Mark Stilley, who has produced a ton of books on the Imperial Navy just in general, is very close to getting ready to publish a new book on Pearl Harbor. He's got a slim volume that he put out for Osprey a number of years ago, which is quite good. But he's got a more comprehensive look at it that's going to be coming out, I think, from Osprey probably later this year. The other thing that we want to dive into at this point, though, is the development of the Japanese carrier fleet. And this remains kind of the granddaddy of books when it comes to the Japanese Navy and their development of technology in general. But for this particular topic, of course, it's the sequel from
Sunburst.
Mark
Yeah.
Peaty, Sunburst, that I'm biased. I illustrated this book. I did all of the appendices and stuff. This book was, frankly, my apprenticeship in how to write a book
Mm.
because I got done with this thing right before Tony and I started doing the Shattered
Shattered Sword.
Sword project. But yeah, it was this. It was doing this book that gave me the hubris to think that I could actually write a book of my own. Anyway,
It is a daunting task for sure.
yeah.
I think,
So so
go
that
ahead.
brings us to First Air Fleet.
Yes.
Um, with and this is not one of those chicken and egg kind of conundrums as to which came first. It's clear that the notion for the attack on Pearl Harbor was the initial
Right.
notion, but what it ends up leading to is the creation of First Air Fleet, which we sometimes style its operational manifestation as Kido Butai. First Air Fleet is an organizational entity, a payroll entity, if you will. Kido Butai is the actual
The
operational chunk of it that
muscle.
actually
Yeah.
fights battles.
Right.
So that ends up happening in April 1941 as as war clouds are darkening, So anyway, go ahead, Seth.
Well, let's talk about it.
Okay.
First Air Fleet is this is something that literally no one had ever seen
Yeah.
anything like it before in
It
the history of naval warfare, and
it
these cats
represents
are the
a
yeah.
it's a huge conceptual leap. And in my opinion, it is one of the fundamental, if not the fundamental reason that the Japanese achieved surprise at Pearl Harbor is because they have made this conceptual leap towards multi-carrier operations in a fashion that neither the Royal Navy nor the US Navy have made at this point. The kind of funny part is that it doesn't appear that this was actually Yamamoto's idea. He knew that he needed a bunch of carriers to attack Pearl Harbor, but he did not have this notion of forming them into a single cohesive unit. In his mind, I'm just going to grab Carrier Division 1 and 2 and eventually Carrier Division 5, and they're going to go do their thing. But you've got other cats within the Navy who have this notion of no, we should actually have a formally established carrier fleet that has all the big flight decks in it, and it should be its own animal and have its own doctrine and way of doing things. And that's how we're going to deliver strategically meaningful results on the battlefield. The genesis for that is also sort of nebulous. There's a tale that Genda was sitting in a movie theater in Britain and saw one of these movie tone newsreels that showed some American fleet units coming into San Francisco after their fleet exercise. I've actually found what I think is the movie reel in question, and it comes from July of 1939, and it shows the two Yorktown carriers, followed by the two Lexington class carriers, steaming into San Francisco under the Golden Gate Bridge. And apparently, Genda, sitting there in the movie theater, was watching these carriers come in, and the light bulb goes on that, having a group of four carriers would do more than just make a really nice looking reel. That we could actually, if we had a group of four big flight decks like that, we could do some kind of interesting things in a warfighting sense. And that kind of put the seed in his mind that we should create this animal. Apparently, what ends up happening then is that Genda starts sharing this idea within the sort of the naval aviation
Right.
community, and he's talking to guys like Inoue. He's talking to Onishi as well and Ozawa, and they start pressuring Yamamoto. You got to do this thing, man. We got to put this unit together. And Yamamoto's like, yeah, I got other things to do. And I forget who it is. I think it may be Onishi, who says, if you don't do this, I'm going to go over your head to the Navy minister and I'm going to make him make you do this.
Mhm.
And at that point, I love it. There's all this insubordination and blackmail just running
Yeah.
around here.
Yeah.
Um, and Yamamoto's like, okay, fine, 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 fine. And on April 1st, 1941, they formally established this thing called First Air Fleet, and carrier divisions 1 and 2 are plonked into it. And now it becomes Nagumo and Kusaka and Genda's problem as to figure out how does this thing actually operate together? Because it's one thing to just sort of say, okay, go create First Air Fleet. It's quite another to build the operational doctrine around how this thing actually operates.
Mhm.
You've got to figure out how do these warships do simple things like how do they steam together? How
Right.
do you actually put four carriers in a formation, have them steam together during daylight, during nighttime? Do we tighten things up during the night? There could be enemy submarines, blah blah blah. How do we during the day, how do we position them in such a way that they can operate their air groups? Don't want them too close together, but don't want them
Right.
too far. We're going to put all our eggs in one basket in terms of visual communications to coordinate all this stuff. How are we going to launch aircraft? Are we going to try to launch all the planes from a given carrier at one stroke? Or are we, as they eventually decide to do, are we going to use smaller deck packages of, say, a squadron apiece with a smaller contingent of fighters, what you would call a deck load strike?
Right.
And we'll put those up because it's faster to get those things up in the air, and we don't have to do these broken launch cycles, with planes circling overhead and burning gasoline.
Like
Anyway,
the U.S.
like the U.S. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, so what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of just kind of nuts and bolts crap that's got to be worked out in terms of how this unit is going to operate together. And, we know too that we're coming into a war. And so April 41, they formally create this thing, and you've got 6 months to get this figured out. If right? And
It,
so there's this frantic evolution and innovation that's going on during this time period as the Japanese are trying to work all these details out. And one of the biggest obstacles is the individual carrier skippers themselves, because those guys are all used to running their own air groups and not having anybody tell
sure.
them what it is they're supposed to be doing. And eventually it is Genda that sort of rams down their throats that no, we're going to operate all of our flight decks as a cohesive entity. And once those planes are up in the air, they are not going to operate separately. They're going to be in one big group under the command of one tactical commander in the air, who's typically going to be the senior air squadron leader from whatever four squadrons we've put up in these things. So, what ends up happening then is that I would argue in that 6 month time span, and particularly then when Shokaku and Zuikaku get it added to the mix, that the capabilities of this unit just metastasize almost like a cancer. And no one knows that this is happening. From the outside, the USN and the Royal Navy think that the Japanese operate carriers pretty much the way we operate carriers, which is to say, as either scouting assets or
Right.
in smaller task forces of one or two flight decks. And of course, they wouldn't put all their carriers into one deck. They didn't even ask that question because the US and the Brits have not made that same conceptual leap to multi carrier operations. And so the notion that the Japanese would put all of these flight decks into one big cohesive unit is just completely off the radar screen as far as they're concerned. We just don't think that people do that kind of thing. And the
Yeah.
result is going to be that the Japanese are going to have this tactical outfit by about September, October of 41 that can do stuff that nobody else can do.
And nobody else can do it until freaking
40,
43.
late
And even
43.
then. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that what I was going to say is that that proves the um, adaptability of the
right.
Imperial Navy at this point because they're
Yes,
taking something that's brand new, a theory that is brand new, and they're creating it for themselves and they're practicing the hell out of it. And that
yes,
is why all through 1941 and 1942 that they can get their strike packages up in the air and on the way in 10 minutes, and we're
yeah.
still sitting there, picking our nose
Cycling
over the
and
Enterprise for 2 hours. It's
right,
ridiculous.
right. Yeah,
But to that end, it took that long for the United States Navy. And by that long, I'm talking, literally 1943, November, when the Essex class comes out and they start hitting, what is it, Bunker Hill and Essex when they hit Rabaul. And then, of
yeah,
course, the Central Pacific Drive and all that jazz for us to come around to that way of thinking. And that just goes to show, and we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the United States lack of preparations for the
right.
attack on Pearl Harbor is that we could not, just as you said, we could not think that anybody could do anything like this because we weren't
Yeah,
thinking that ourselves. And it took us 2 years, damn near,
yeah,
just a month shy of 2 years to be able to operate on that same type of level. And it just shows the
yeah,
adaptability and this, popping of the light bulb, as you said, of this idea that became the world's most powerful striking force from
yeah,
1941 through 1942.
yeah. I think that's right. The light bulb had to go on, and of course, there's the awful pressure of knowing that you're about to attack an opponent that is incredibly powerful. And yeah, we've got to come up with some sort of tactical innovation here that's going to level the playing field. I would argue that for the brief span of time that Kuda Butai was really a thing, up until June of 42, that it was as revolutionary in its way as the German Panzer divisions were in
Yeah.
theirs. That you look around the major militaries in the world, everybody had armored divisions, but it was only the Germans that somehow, knew the secret sauce of,
Right.
how to make a really good armored division. And it was because everything was united by radios, everything was motorized. And the other thing that was interesting about the Germans is their flexible ability to tailor conf groups to specific tactical tasks that had to be done. Okay, I need this battalion of infantry. I got a company of tanks, need some combat engineers, just mix and match, put together this conf group and do its thing. You see that same sort of cohesiveness, I guess I would say, in the Japanese as well, in that they've got uh, four, soon to be six big flight decks. They have functional aircraft in all three of the major slots: fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo slash level bomber. They have excellent aviators in all of those billets, and they have at least the workings of a doctrine, deck load strikes, unified by all of our eggs in one basket, if you will. We've worked out the nuts and bolts, and that feeds into this doctrine. So they've got the whole package, and nobody else even could appreciate what that package was, at least at the beginning of the war.
Nobody could conceptualize that until
Yeah,
they actually did it themselves. As they
I,
say, imitation is the highest form of flattery.
yeah. Now I would push back. There, the Americans had anticipated that there could be a raid
Sure.
against
Oh, yeah.
Pearl Harbor,
Hell, they
but
did it themselves
they
in one of
did
the
it
fleet bombings.
themselves.
Twice, as
Exactly.
a matter of fact. But that's,
Exactly. That's exactly right. But in the American mind, a raid was one carrier, maybe
right.
two,
Right.
launching one strike package to come in and do a hit and run attack and then get the hell out of Dodge. Kido Butai's plan of battle is a completely different animal. And then
Yeah.
again, not only are we coming in to attack the naval anchorage, we're going to shut down the air power on
Yeah.
this island as well. So,
We're going to flatten this place and we're
yeah,
going to eliminate it to their theory.
temporarily.
Eliminate it as any kind of offensive threat
Right.
to our operations. So, that being said, the Japanese are knowing that they know that they have to go from Japan all the way to
Yeah.
Pearl Harbor, and that's a hell of a long way to go.
Yes.
And they're going, as you said before, they're going the northern, unseen route, if you will, through the northern Pacific. We all know this, but those ships suck down bunker oil like crazy.
Yeah.
and they need fuel. So this is something that Yamamoto, and I spit it out earlier in this episode, that he said, "Oh, and by the way, we need to refuel at sea or whatever." I forget
Uh-huh.
exactly what his words were, but this is a huge part of this operation because there's a lot
Yes.
of questions like, how the hell are these guys going to get there? What are you going to stop here and fuel up? How's this going to work? So this is
Yeah.
another, I don't want to say innovation because the U.S. was doing it too, but not to this degree.
Right. And we did not understand that the Japanese had this capability
Right.
either. And so that too gave us an unwarranted sense of immunity from Japanese attack, and that we considered ourselves the foremost practitioners of underway replenishment. And it would be interesting to talk in more depth to Sal Mercogliano about this, because he knows everything there is to know about fast oilers, particularly in the early part of the war. And our unrep capabilities, of course, early in the war are much more primitive than what we could do later on in the war. Um, but at this time, we didn't even think that the Japanese were capable of doing side by side refueling, and we weren't clear as to whether they could even do fore and aft. Take a battleship, run a hose off over the fantail of the battleship, and refuel a destroyer that or a cruiser that's behind you. And there was an interesting article that came out a few years ago by a gentleman, David Fuquay, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, who demonstrated. He went in and did some digging that actually Japanese refueling capabilities were much more sophisticated than we suspected, that they could do side by side refueling and that sort of thing. And that really gives them the ability to reach out and touch us. That initial versions of the Japanese plan in some cases said that, well, we're not going to have enough fuel to get there and back, so we're going to abandon a couple of our carriers off of Hawaii.
Yeah.
That was in some of the
Yeah, please.
please no. But so at the same time that Kido Butai is evolving its attack capabilities, the Japanese are also frantically innovating on the unrep capabilities that they have, and the result is that all of this stuff comes together in a neat little package by the fall of 1941, to the point that the Japanese now can confidently get an entire task force to Hawaii and back.
And back. Yeah, and back
Yeah.
was the key. So let's briefly, we don't need to go into every single strike group wave
Yeah.
is going to carry this and that and the other, but what is
No.
the overall final plan here as we're literally, the fleet has sailed. This is
Yeah.
November 26th. The fleet is at sea. We are on the way. How is this going
Well,
to shake out?
and it's even scarier than that. Okay, so in a nutshell, um, we're going to go after the outboard battleships with modified torpedoes that have got, wooden fins and other gizmos on them to make sure that the torpedo not only enters the water at the correct angle and the correct heading, but then is not going to dive very deeply
Right.
down into the muds. They figured out how to do that. So that is going to be the implement that we're going to use to attack the outboard battleships. The inboard battleships we're going to go after with high level bombers that are going to be dropping these modified 16-inch naval shells that come from the guns of Nagato and Mutsu. It's that kind of a shell. We're going to machine it down into this teardrop shape. We're going to put fins on the back of it, a couple fuses. And now we've got this heavy armor piercing bomb, a 1,600-pound bomb that, if dropped from 3,000 meters, should have sufficient kinetic woof to make it through the deck armor of these inboard battleships. And so they determined that instead of flying their planes, their Kates in VIX of 3, they're actually going to use VIX of 5. So there's a lot of innovation going on here too, and just in terms of strike package tailoring. How many planes are going to be operating, and so we're gonna parade these VICs of 5 Kates over the inboard battleship row one at a time, and we're going to go after discrete targets there. We're going to train in such a way that the 4 planes trailing the one in front, we're going to have our best bombardier in that lead Kate, and all of the other bombardiers are going to be watching that guy. And when he drops, we all drop and knock our glasses off our face, so that hopefully these bombs come down in a V-shaped pattern, and we'll get one of those battleships
Right.
in them. So That's what we're going to do on the anchorage.
Which of course they do, by the way. Spoiler
Sure.
alert. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which they do. Second wave is going to be primarily dive bombers that'll be going after the anchorage, and then there's all the stuff that's going to be happening out of the air bases that we're going to shellac Wheeler and Hickam at the
Mhm.
outset. We'll deal with Kaneohe later because the dive bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku are going to be devoted to first wave air suppression. We won't be able to use the level bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku to go after Kaneohe until the second attack wave comes up. But you can see that there's a lot of different packages here that
Moving
have to
parts,
be
yeah.
put together. Yeah, a lot of moving parts, and they're going to be attacking this island. We've got diagrams of that we should put up at this point, but
Sure.
yeah, we're going to be hitting the island from all points of the compass in the course of this operation.
If you look at the I don't want to call it a flight plan, but I mean that's kind of what it is. It's just like an octopus because they just
Yeah,
come around and they just encircle everything and swoop down it from all different angles on both raids too, both
yeah,
strikes. Both
yeah,
strikes. So it's not just a one-time show, not at all.
right.
Um, Midget submarines. We
Oh
talked about
yeah,
the torpedo, the
got to
the
talk
shallow
about
torpedoes. We got to talk about the midget subs, and we don't need to get into the specifics.
yeah,
We'll do that in a later episode because I know there's a lot of hubbub and mystique about the midget submarines, but it's part of it, and it was
yeah.
seen initially as an important part of the raid.
Which I just don't understand. I look at the overall operational plan for this raid as being really gifted, really pretty brilliant in a lot of respects, but it all hinges on surprise.
Right.
And introducing midget subs into this operation is just a boneheaded move because if there's anything that could potentially tip your hand to the
So
Americans that something bad is coming, it's enemy submarines lurking off your most heavily defended Pacific naval bastion. And that is exactly what ends up happening. But this is a portion of the plan that is introduced very late in the planning process. It's like mid-September that they start talking about, hey, we could use mini submarines to sneak into the harbor. Initially, it was thought that they would position first fleet subs and then mini subs off the mouth of the harbor
right.
and go after escaping.
Yamamoto said as much.
Says, and they should have stuck to that, frankly. But then they get this notion that, well, if we actually were to sneak these mini subs into the harbor itself, they would have a much better chance of delivering war results. Spoiler alert, you're not going to be able to maneuver through an enemy harbor that has thousands of eyeballs without
Right.
being unseen. It's crazy. And there's at least some evidence that there were a lot of people that were not in favor of the mini subs being added to the plan too. It just seemed like trying to graft a trunk onto an alligator or something. Why are you bothering to
Right.
do this? Because in truth, if you look at just the package of torpedo planes that's being devoted to the attacks on the anchorage, it's
Plenty
45 or
of power.
yeah, plenty of power.
Plenty.
Five mini subs adds 10 more torpedoes to that are honestly not much more powerful than your airdrop torps in any place, in any case, and just enormously magnify the potential of surprise being lost. It's not worth it. It should have been clear that it was not worth it. But eventually, Yamamoto kind of gets lobbied by some of the sub guys that, no, you got to let us do this, man.
Yeah. We
And
went in on the party.
we want in on the party, which is just the dumbest reason for, letting a unit do its thing. But yeah, anyway, the net result is that there are going to be five mini subs that are going to be carried by five mother subs. They're going to be released off the harbor mouth the night before, and they're supposed to sneak in and hopefully not only sneak up to the mouth of the harbor, but actually sneak into it.
Mhm. And as we see, some of them do and some of them
Some of
don't.
them don't. Yes.
Some of them don't. All right. My goodness. That's a
My
lot there.
goodness.
Yeah,
Yeah, there is.
that's a lot there. Is there any, I mean, I'm sure there are things we have forgotten so far. And again, this is one of a series of humpteen episodes we're doing on Pearl Harbor here, but
Pearl.
my
The
goodness, is it,
last
yeah, anything else?
one thing I do want to talk about just a little bit, just came to me right now, is this whole business of radio silence
Mm,
and
mm,
the persistent belief that that there was chatter on the way over. There have been a number of revisionist historians who have proposed the notion that, oh, there was no way that Kido Butai could have navigated all the way across the Pacific without having some radio chatter. And
Mm.
there was this ocean liner named the Lure Line, which supposedly, captured um, transmissions from the Japanese fleet as it came over, and that should have been the smoking gun that would have tipped us off, and blah, 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 blah. Also, the presence of potentially encounters with Russian freighters that were running supplies over from the West Coast up on the Great Arc through the
Right.
Aleutians, blah, 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 blah. Anybody who gets really deep into the weeds on that kind of stuff, there was a gentleman who worked for, I believe, the NSA, a guy named Phil Jacobson, who published just a whole series of articles that just basically rebutted all of these things. And I would urge anybody who's really interested in that topic to go look for Phil Jacobson's stuff because it's definitive. The bottom line is that from the Japanese perspective, the maintenance of OPSEC was paramount. And so they went so far as to, in some cases, physically remove the radio telegraph keys from the warships and put them under lock and key. This fleet, when it left Hidokapu Bay, rather hastily, actually, because side note here, this whole business of the modified airdrop torpedoes to go after the outboard battleships, Battleship Row, that was done very, very late as well. And that batch of torpedoes with those modifications didn't
Right.
show up to the
Right.
carriers until like a day before they sortied. I mean,
Yeah,
just
I remember that.
talk about, hurry up. Anyway, when the fleet leaves, it is under conditions of total radio silence. And the only person in the fleet who has the authority to make any sort of transmission whatsoever is Nagumo himself. And he is told that you cannot do this unless the success or failure of the mission is directly at stake. So there was no idle chit chat going back
Right.
and forth between Japanese ships during the course of this operation. It's nonsense. And the result is that, yeah, they do get to north, 200 some miles off of Oahu completely undetected.
And I don't really, I guess people just need something to talk about or just need something to argue with people about because, I mean, we were looking for the damn carriers.
Yeah, we
Kimmel
did
told
as
Leighton, find the friggin' carriers. What do you mean you lost four carriers? How do you
right.
lose four carriers? Find them. And he
Yeah,
couldn't.
yeah.
And it wasn't just him. It was Rochefort and all the people in Hypo and back at Op 20G in DC. They're
Nobody
looking
got
for the
on.
carrier. Gone. Because why? Because they ghosted everybody on the planet.
Yeah,
To
and they were
exactly to
also
your point.
they are also running a very comprehensive set of counterintelligence operations too to generate fake radio traffic
Sure.
that were mimicking the carriers as well. So
And that's a whole nother that that
that's a
that
whole
is
nother thing.
fascinating because I mean,
Yeah,
and we can talk very briefly, when they move in the fleet up to Hitakapu, they go so far as to don't I think it's like cadets or something. They put them in uniform to have them walk around near Kure to
yeah, right. Yeah, there's
something
all
like
sorts of
that.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
there's all sorts of crazy.
Subterfuge.
Yeah, subterfuge. That's exactly right. The other thing, and I think we've alluded this in previous episodes as well, there's just a lot of false positives at this time in the intelligence situation. That from the Americans' standpoint, we're intercepting a fair amount of radio traffic, but we don't have the people at this point to translate even a tithe of this stuff. So your odds of finding any sort of smoking gun is low to begin with. And we're sending out warnings to our various I know that we're going to get into this in the next
Yeah.
episode. There's just a lot of false positives in
There's
there,
a flurry. Yeah.
and the reason is because the Japanese are going to attack us everywhere. There are ships that are moving towards Malaya. There are ships that are getting lined up to go against the Philippines. The Japanese have this enormously intricate plan of campaign that is going to be putting troops all over God's green earth here in the next week. And so, yes, as the Americans are getting all of these various snippets, it's like, oh, it could be the Philippines, it could be this. Guess what? It's all of them. It's all of the
Yeah.
above.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we can get into that. Betty Stark, he was
Richmond Kelly
probably a
Turner too.
yeah, yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah. But Stark especially, I think, he was a good dude, but he was I think it was Kimmel called him, or no, I'm sorry, Halsey called him that, every message that he sent was a cry wolf message
Right,
months
right.
before the attack. So when the real
Yeah,
stuff started coming through, they were like, "Good God, again?"
again,
So there's
right.
so much, and we'll talk about that next week about the
Yeah,
U.S.
we'll talk about that.
preparations for it. But it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. The bottom line is that, spoiler alert, the Japanese managed to achieve the magic trifecta of surprise at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. And it reaps enormous benefits for them when this attack actually goes down.
Climb Mount Nitaka.
Yes. All right.
All
Now
right,
I'm done talking.
all right, we're good.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this sucker. We're gonna
Yes.
pick up this conversation again next week. Actually, for Inside Baseball, it'll be Thursday for when you and I record it, but it'll air next week. So we're going to
That's
continue this conversation about U.S. preps. All right. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review if you choose to do so. If you have a question, actually, hold on before I say that. If you have a comment, send it to unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And I say
yes,
this because,
because
no offense, I get
I'm
and it's my own
I,
damn fault because I say if you have a question
I
or a
know.
comment, but good gravy, gosh almighty, the amount of questions that I get, there is no way in hell I can ever answer all that stuff. I would be doing this all the time, and I'm sitting in an office at my job, so I can't,
Yeah.
guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No,
Save
that's
those
exactly.
questions. Yeah, save them. We'll do a Q&A again, maybe two. Those are always fun, but that ain't happening right now. So save those questions. But if you have a comment or if you just want to say, hey, you guys are cool, which is always nice, you can send us an email at
Right.
unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So, once again, my name is Seth Paridon. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my friend, thank you as always.
Yeah. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to everyone for continuing to watch our
Mhm.
conversations. It's baffling to me that you seem to want to do that, but thank you. So yes, and we will see you again next week.